All right, folks, it's Knox with IT Inspired again, and we are back to keep talking about the SQL Server lessons. So like I mentioned at the beginning, SQL Server does have free versions of it. So you who are wanting to get started in Microsoft SQL Server, you can absolutely get started with enterprise-grade software for free. And this, you can see I've got this page pulled up, SQL Server 2017. The Express Edition is what you're going for. As long as you're not dealing with databases that are bigger than 10 gigs, or you want to use some of the advanced DBA type features, you can definitely use this just to get started. This is going to be a perfect tool for someone who wants to get started in, especially in development, or in really any of the 3 SQL roles, but especially in development and in reporting. Now, I will say for those of you who are wanting to go the DBA path, you might be more interested in looking at the Developer Edition. That is also free. It is absolutely not recommended to use in a production environment because they will get you, you'll be audited, and that'll be really bad. But it basically has every single feature unlocked to the Developer Edition. So when you get into the high availability features or scheduled tasks that require the agent, you would definitely probably want to look at the Developer Edition instead of Express, because those features don't come with Express. But you can download the SQL Server 2017 Express Edition. Now, that's cool and all, but let's take a closer look at this and how this topology how it actually works. We're not going to save this, we're going to start. So, the way it works in an enterprise environment is you'll be down here working on your desktop, and you probably will not install SQL Server on your desktop. You'll install SQL Server on a actual server, and you know we've kind of drawn this before with the traditional server logo. Here we go. It's still not great, but it's a lot better than it was, right? And what you'll do is you'll install SQL Server, that Express Edition, over here on a server. And let's see if I can get my pen here. Yeah, we'll install SQL Server Express on the server, and we'll connect to it and work with it from the desktop using a tool called SSMS, or SQL Server Management Studio. That is also free, and you can just, a quick search of SQL Server Management Studio will bring up SSMS. And you can see the link right here to download SQL Server Management Studio 17.5 as the most recent version today. In fact, you'll see we're on 2017 is the current version of SQL Server, and 17.5 is the current version of SSMS. If you are so inclined that you want to look at older versions of SQL Server, I'm pretty sure you can go all the way back to 2012 and download that if you want. But you can absolutely download these and get these running today. Now, if you don't have a lab environment, you don't have a server, don't worry. You can download both of these on your desktop and run them pretty much without issue. It is a pretty lightweight tool. It shouldn't hog all your resources, so you can definitely follow along with these download and install steps directly on your desktop if you don't have a lab environment. Now, I do have a lab environment, and I am remoted into it right now. I've already done all the downloading, and in fact, I've downloaded and installed SSMS on my desktop already. But the SSMS download and install, it's pretty straightforward. You just download it and click install. It requires a reboot when you're done, and that's really about it. And we'll go through using it in a completely separate video because it's kind of a big thing on its own. But the installation of SQL Server isn't exactly small either. There's a lot of questions and planning involved with it, so I wanted to walk you through that installation here on this server. We've called it SQL Test 1. It is joined to a domain environment. But if you don't have a server or a domain environment, like I said, don't worry. The steps are pretty similar on your desktop. So, without further ado, why don't we just get started? I'm going to run this as admin. And you know what? Let's go through a basic install because that's what we're trying to do. And I accept. All right, so do I want to install this on my C drive? Yep, that sounds fine. And it's downloading that Express Edition packages now. I'm going to pause it because this may take a little while, and then we'll go from there. Right, we're back, so you can see it says SQL Server 2017 Express Edition installation has completed successfully. It gives you a whole bunch of information that may or may not be relevant to you depending on what you're trying to learn here. But one of the things you can see pretty quickly, it created a default instance here, SQL Express, and it defaulted to using my account that I used to install it as the SQL administrator. So, you know, that's a big part of the DBA role, is determining who can log into SQL and what they can do. So, you know, be careful if you're installing it that you're going to be the one who's in charge of being a DBA. Let's click Customize and see what it brings up. It should bring up a unique little installation. This is a lot more like the old installation from SQL 2016 and previous. Let's go through it. Next. Alright, so it's telling us that the Windows Firewall isn't configured correctly. We are going to go over that in just a minute. So, now we are performing a new installation of SQL Server 2017. And this is some basic info that it's getting us. I'm going to say I accept the terms. All right, so what are we adding to this? So in the instance features here, since this is the Express Edition, we pretty much only have the engine. If you were installing the Developer Edition, you would see a ton of options here, including analytics services. You would see reporting. Well, actually, you wouldn't see reporting services in 2017. That's a separate install. Integration services, just all kinds of things. So let's just take this as it is, and we're going to click Next. You can see the installation root directory is here in Program Files. That's fine by me. I'm going to leave that. If you want to move it, you... Okay, this is a big one, big question here. So usually the default is to set this to default instance. And what that means is we plan to only install one SQL Server on this Windows operating system. And that's going to leave this as the name MS SQL Server. So let's just check here real quick at what my IP address is, and I'll try and explain this a little bit more, what this is going to do. 10.10.20.100. Wow, that is just an awesome IP address. Okay, so let me bring up my notepad. And since this is on the default instance, if you're not in a domain environment, or if you're just doing this by IP address, you would connect to 10.10.20.100. And that's it. That would take you straight into this SQL Server so that you can manage this SQL Server at 10.10.20.100. But if I wanted to name this instance, if I were planning on installing a bunch of different SQL servers on this Windows operating system, it would be 10.10.20.100. So you would connect to this server first, and then you would say / which instance. So I would call this instance 1 maybe, or give it a more specific name, like maybe what your application is. And then if I needed to have a second installation of SQL on here, maybe for a different application, I could do 10.10.20.100 instance 2, and so on. So this is a big decision to make. This also has networking implications, which we'll go over when we get to the firewall. But for now, you need to kind of decide if I'm going to install 1 or 2 or 3 SQL servers, or however many SQL servers on this operating system. That could also have licensing implications. Microsoft changes their licensing seemingly every day. So it depends on how you license it by core or by cal. So before you make those decisions, don't just rush into those decisions if you're in a production environment. Do plan it out. But if you're just trying to get one SQL server up and running in your environment, in a lab environment so that you can learn, the default instance will be fine, and we would just connect by either the host name of this server, SQL Test 1, or by its IP address. So I'm going to leave this to the default instance, which will have the name MS SQL Server. Okay. So this is going to be talking about the service accounts. The SQL Server does run as different users or a different user. It could be a service account, which you can use group manage service accounts in these versions of SQL. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're in the sysadmin side of things, if you're a heavy user of Active Directory, you can do that. Again, unless you're in an Active Directory environment, there's really no need to tinker with this too much. But if you want to, you can simply click on this browse, and if you need to set it to a location, we can set it to our domain, and I can type in any account that I really want here. Sure, we'll use my hacker account to run the service, and then you would specify the password for that account in here, and you would want the account name and the password here. Startup type for the engine. This is the actual SQL Server itself, the database engine. That's definitely something you want up and running, especially in a production environment. This needs to start with very high priority. Now, the SQL Server browser, this is for remote users to or applications to find the SQL Server on the network. I am definitely going to turn that on, since I am going to be remotely accessing this. Again, that does have firewall implications that we are going to talk about in just a second. Okay. Specify the SQL Server administrators right here where my mouse is. That is a big one. If you just need to add yourself very quickly, you can do add current user. It's already got me added here. So you can also click add, and you can specify more accounts right here. Super easy to do. Now, because I am in an Active Directory environment, and I have installed this over using an Active Directory account, this is set to Windows Authentication mode, meaning when I, the end user, open up SSMS and I go to access this SQL Server, the SQL Server is going to communicate with my Active Directory to determine if I have access to this SQL Server or not, based on my Active Directory account. If I needed to create an account directly in SQL Server, it's going to ask me first to set a SA system administrator, the SA account password. It definitely doesn't hurt to do this, but make sure that once you create the SA password, you probably want to get in there and do whatever you can to disable it pretty quickly, or use a really, really strong password, because the SA account is certainly what hackers are going to try and brute force attack. So I'm going to leave this on Windows Authentication mode, but if you don't have an Active Directory environment, if you're installing this on your desktop, you're going to want to choose this mixed mode and type in a secure password where the username is going to be SA. We'll talk about that more when we actually get to launching SSMS, but I'm going to leave this on Windows Authentication. Now, before we proceed, let's take a look at data directories. This is a big one, especially if you're in the DBA. Check this out, this backup directory versus the user database directory. So user databases, these are going to be our databases. These are going to be the databases that we want to maintain and work with. I have set up on the server a couple different disk drives. You can see I've got one here, the E drive, where I've got something called SQL data, and I'm going to make a folder here called databases. That's where I want to store my databases and their associated log files. In a production environment, that's going to be one subset of disks, maybe SSDs, maybe even NVMe now, but they're going to be on some sort of RAID 1 or RAID 10 or RAID 6, something where we can have disk failure and allow those disks to die, or not allow a disk to die, but if a disk dies, the databases themselves become still available, and it gives us time to swap out a new disk and keep that redundancy in place in case of disk failure. Now, backup directory, I'm going to back these up to a different place, a different set of disks. Why do you want to do that? Well, let's say the disks that hold the data die. If we had our backups on that same disks, we would not only lose the production data, we would lose their backups too. So we definitely want to back these up to not only a different set of disks, you would actually probably in a production environment want to back these up over the network to a network share. You can absolutely do that here in this dialog box. I've just set up a different set of disk subsystems here. So I'm just going to call this backups, and we're going to back them up here. So you can see I've got my production databases and their logs installed to one set of disks. The backups are going to be targeting a different set of disks, and the data directory root, which is essentially where the SQL systems are installed, are going to be on my C drive. They're the binaries. Now, Temp TB, this is another important one that you can change. You don't necessarily have to change this, but you would want this to be on high-performance disks, fast disks, because a lot of transactions take place in temp. A lot goes in, a lot goes out. Now, user instances, users are allowed to run a separate instance of the database engine. This is not something we really need to talk about right now for beginners, as well as file stream. But if you were building an application that where users could upload files and you wanted to store those files in your database, this is something that you would want to check and work on here. Like I said, this is getting a little more advanced. This is definitely treading down the advanced DBA route. If you were going for SQL certification for DBAs, you would absolutely have to learn about this. But we're just trying to get you up and running, and I'm trying to show you that SQL Server installation can get very complicated very quickly. So, the big things that you want to take away here are setting up Windows authentication mode versus mixed mode, depending on if you're an Active Directory or if you're just installing this on your desktop. Specifying the users down here, and then, of course, setting the data directories. This is very, very, very important. Okay, cool. Let's go to next. And it is going to go through the installation progress now, guys. So I'm going to pause this, and we can come back to it here shortly. Okay, that installation got done, but of course we are not completely done, right? Let me show you some other things we've got to do real quick because this is important. All right, this is done. Let's go ahead and close it. Yep, I'm sure I want to quit. All right, so that got done installing. Now we need to talk about how to actually manage this SQL Server. You're maybe familiar with the services section of your Windows Server here, and that's where you can see what all the services are running on this machine. This is not where you manage your Microsoft Windows, your Microsoft SQL Server instances, even though they're here. They're here. You can see them here. It looks like we're actually running two instances, one called SQL Express and one called MS SQL Server. Now, MS SQL Server is the one that we just went through that extensive installation process through. So let's take a look at what we can do to actually manage this. What you want to open is something called SQL Server 2017 Configuration Manager. If you open up Microsoft SQL Server 2017 right here, you'll see it. And right here under SQL Server Services, we can see what services are actually running. Now, we did tell it to run the browser, and we did tell it to start. There's an engine instance here for MS SQL Server, and another instance here for SQL Express. I'm going to stop the SQL Express instance because we weren't really interested in running that. And it stopped. So now we're just running one instance of SQL Server on this machine, and that way when we connect, we'll be connecting to this version of SQL Server. And check that out. It did log on as my Knox Hacker account that we had created in a previous nugget where I was talking about signing out correctly. Now, we're not quite done because we wanted to connect to this remotely. And since we wanted to connect to this remotely, we have to tell the SQL Server first, under the protocols for this one, to be enabled for TCP/IP. Let's do enable. Yep, any changes will not be saved. You have to restart the service first. That's fine. Let's hit enable. And then let's go back to the services and restart the engine service here by just clicking restart. Now, I mentioned a few times throughout this process that there would be firewall implications depending on which instances we chose to install. So let's go ahead and bring up the firewall with advanced security. We do have to make a rule to allow this traffic in. So Microsoft SQL Server, the default instance, when we did that default instance versus named instance, when we do the default instance, it listens on one port, and that port is TCP 1433. So we have to allow the port for internet connections or network-bound connections inward on TCP 1433. So let's click port, hit next. TCP specified ports 1433. So we're saying the rule is going to allow us to connect to TCP 1433. The action is allow this connection. And, you know, this is fine. This is a lab environment. If it's not in a lab environment, you know, you definitely don't want to allow public connections to your databases. But just make those choices correctly. Now, if you didn't choose the default instance, if you chose a named instance, you're going to have to allow a program, because the port that the named instance listens on changes. It's dynamic. So we're going to have to browse to that installation of Microsoft SQL Server. And I think it's in bin. Yep, right here. This SQL servr.exe. That's what you're going to allow in. So any inbound connection to that program, no matter what port it's listening on, will be allowed. And that's what you want to do if you did a named instance installation of SQL Server. But since we did the default, I'm going to go back and do TCP 1433, allow. This is fine because it's a lab, and I'm going to call this SQL inbound. Finish. Now, remember I also did say we would have to make a rule for that SQL browser too. It listens on UDP 1434. And we're going to do the same drill here. We're going to call this SQL browser inbound. And hit finish. Okay. At this point, we should be able to connect. What do you say we give it a shot? Okay, I've switched account to a domain account. That way we can use our Active Directory credentials to log in. I've also installed SSMS already. Like I said, that's just download it and run that installer. It is really straightforward. It does require a reboot though. All right, so you see when you install SSMS, it actually installs two things under Microsoft SQL Server 2017. The first one is for remotely managing all those functionalities of the server itself, like the configuration manager that we just looked at directly on the server. But the tool that we want to use is SSMS, or SQL Server Management Studio. So it is under Microsoft SQL Server 20 or Microsoft SQL Server Tool 17. I'm going to launch that now. And it brings up this. So we're going to be connecting to a database engine, not necessarily an SSIS, SSRS, or SSAS, but just the database itself. And the server name here, you could either type the IP address or the host name of that server. My host name of that server was SQL Test 1, but 10.10.20.100 would also work. Now remember, we set it up to be Windows Authentication, so it automatically defaults to using the credentials that I already have signed into this machine with. So it's just going to pass my Active Directory token straight to the SQL Server, which is going to verify that it's a good token and let me log in. If you did do the mixed mode, maybe because you installed it on your desktop, you would just click this drop down, choose SQL Server Authentication. Your login is going to be SA, and then whatever password you originally set up for that SA account. So I'm going to switch it back to Windows Authentication here. I've got SQL Test 1 highlighted. I'm just going to click Connect. And look at that. It let me in right up here. You can see under Object Explorers, I am now in SQL Test 1. Here it's empty. We haven't created any databases yet, but there are system databases. So if you feel so compelled as to browse around and see what's going on in your master model MSDB or Temp TBs, you can do that here. But at this moment, you now have a SQL Server instance up and running that you can connect to. And in future videos, we're going to show you how to actually work in this SSMS tool to start doing some really cool SQL data work. All right, get out there and try it out.